Hi, welcome to Coffee and Astronomy. This is Jim Craig, and today I'm going to do the second of a two-part series I'm doing on telescope mounts. Last time I spoke about altitude azimuth or alt-az mounts, and today I want to talk about equatorial mounts. Now this is kind of complicated, so if you see me glancing down, I wrote some notes to make sure that I would include everything. Because we live on a planet that rotates, we're moving from west to east. If you look at the Earth's rotation from the North Pole, it looks like it's going counterclockwise. It makes the stars, moon, the planets, the sun look like they're going from east to west across the sky, even though they're not necessarily moving, at least not in a noticeable way in the amount of, over the course of a night. And the Earth turns once every 24 hours. Well, once every 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4.09 seconds, give or take a few thousandths of a second. But that's an entirely different issue. But that means if you point your telescope somewhere, you point it at a star, if that telescope doesn't move, that star is going to go out of your field of view. And depending on how wide your field of view, it's going to happen fairly quickly. However, if you can compensate for that motion, you can track a star. Now with an alt-azimuth, you're going to go left and up, left and up, left and up until you reach the meridian. Then you're going to go, right and up, right and up, right and up until you reach the meridian. Then you're going to go right down, right down, right down. But that's not quite the way things move in the sky. With an equatorial mount, you have one of the axes, because it's got, left, right, up and down, but the left-right axis is pointed at the North Celestial Pole. And that is, imagine the North Pole and extending a line out to infinity above the North Pole, pointing at that point in the sky. It's not exactly Polaris in the Northern Hemisphere, but it's pretty darn close. Then all you have to do to track with that star is just track along the east-west direction. And it's as simple as that. Kind of. Now, if you have a motorized equatorial mount, if you have it well polar aligned, and I'll talk about polar alignment in a moment, but if you have it well polar aligned, you put it on that object, it's going to track right along with it, and it's going to track it all night if you should choose. Now, an alt-azimuth mount is fine if you're just doing visual tracking, and if it's a motorized alt-azimuth tracking mount, for visual it's going to be fine, but if you want to do astrophotography, you need a good equatorial mount if you want to do deep sky objects like double stars, nebulae, galaxies, all of those sorts of things. You can do planetary with an alt-azimuth pretty well. You can do the moon easily with an alt-azimuth, but for these deep sky objects, you really need an equatorial mount. Now there are different kinds of equatorial mounts. There's the German equatorial mount, which is often abbreviated GEM. There's the fork mount, which is fairly common. There are split ring mounts, which are the big mounts you see in professional observatories. Which one you use is going to depend on what you're trying to do. Now for astrophotography, you can do astrophotography with a fork mount, but one of the problems with the fork mount is you can't put a counterweight on it. So say, for example, you put a camera on your telescope is now heavier. And if you use guide cameras and all of that sort of thing, it's going to get even heavier, and you need to have a counterweight in order for it to track properly. German equatorials are built to have counterweights on them. On my scope, I have 18 pounds of counterweight that I can move up and down to counterbalance the other scope. And when it's properly balanced, if I have everything adjusted just right and I just loosen everything, it's going to stay in the same position. It's not going to tip. It's not going to have one end heavier than the other. Now, one of the critical parts, if you're doing astrophotography or just want to track something all night with an equatorial mount, is that axis that I was talking about has to point to the celestial north. You need to get that polar alignment nailed down as close as possible. It is critical. And there are lots of tools and various tricks and tips for getting your telescope polar aligned. And I will confess, only recently have I gotten my polar alignment down to what I consider to be an acceptable degree of accuracy. But if you don't have it just right and you're tracking along and you're taking something a time exposure photo, Your stars, instead of being nice little dots, little circles, are going to be little streaks. They're going to be elongated. And you don't want that. So again, you have to make sure that your polar alignment is just so. Now, equatorial mounts are fairly expensive compared to their alt-azimuth counterparts. That was one of the reasons that John Dobson came up with his cheap alt-azimuth mount called the Dobsonian mount now, is because equatorial mounts are expensive, because they are precision devices. But to me, it's worth the expense. But there's also a very, very steep learning curve. For example, if you're tracking something when it hits the meridian, that's due south, you actually have to flip the whole scope over, or things don't go quite right. And if you've got it automated, the software has to take care of that meridian flip for you, make sure everything is aimed again and starts guiding again properly. So there is a learning curve. But if you want to get into astrophotography, there is nothing quite like having an equatorial mount. Most of my best astrophotos were taken after I got my scope with an equatorial mount, and I still use alt-azimuth mounts for a few things, but for the most part, I wouldn't do without it. So this is Jim Craig with Coffee and Astronomy, asking you, if you enjoy this, to give me a thumbs up, to subscribe, and if you really enjoy this and want to help me bring these to you, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month. I'll bring you these videos. I'll bring you exclusive content. Last week I did my outtakes because, well, I'm a human being and I make mistakes. You've even heard some here. These were pretty big, but that's available only to my patrons. And I have different tiers of patronage, so depending on what level you're at, you'll get different perks. And to go there, to find that, you just go to patreon.com/planetofmystery. That's planet_of_mystery. So until next time, this is Jim Craig with Coffee and Astronomy, hoping that you get out there, and whether you're using your eyes, a telescope on an alt-azimuth mount, telescope on an equatorial mount, binoculars, or your phone, whatever, get out there and enjoy the sky, because there is so much to see.